The house was too quiet for a place that had supposedly been lived in by two people who loved each other, and the silence felt accusatory, like it knew something I had only just begun to admit to myself and was daring me to say it out loud, because once you name a thing like that, it stops being a suspicion and turns into a wound that doesn't close. I sat on the edge of the bed we used to share, staring at the faint crease where her body had slept for years, replaying conversations that now sounded rehearsed, her voice calm and patient in moments where she should have been annoyed or defensive, her phone always face down, her sudden concern for privacy dressed up as needing space. And it hit me all at once that none of this had been chaos or drift or coincidence, because she hadn't wandered away from me. She had relocated with intention. The worst part wasn't imagining the sex, even though that image intruded anyway when I least wanted it, but realizing how carefully she had dismantled our life while smiling at me across the dinner table, asking about my day, kissing my cheek with a softness that felt loving, until I realized it was practiced. I didn't catch her in bed with someone else, didn't see incriminating messages pop up at the perfect dramatic moment, didn't have the kind of discovery that people talk about like it's a lightning strike, because this was slower and crueler, like watching fog roll in until you suddenly can't see your own hands. It started with patterns that made sense only when stacked together, her sudden interest in clothes she never wore for me, the gym sessions that ran long and left her glowing in a way I hadn't seen in years, the way she started talking about independence and rediscovering herself, with language that sounded borrowed from someone else's mouth. When I asked her one night, trying to keep my voice steady, whether there was someone else, she laughed softly and told me I was projecting my stress onto her, explaining with a therapist's calm how damaging distrust could be to a marriage, and I remember apologizing to her for even asking while something inside me quietly broke. After that, I stopped asking and started observing, because once denial cracks, curiosity rushes in to fill the space, and I began noticing how she'd step into another room to take calls, how her laughter sounded different when she wasn't talking to me, lighter, less burdened, how she'd come home relaxed in ways that had nothing to do with me. I replayed past months like surveillance footage, catching moments I had ignored because love teaches you how to look away, and every small lie suddenly had a purpose, every excuse a destination. I realized she wasn't distant because she was unhappy. She was distant because she was occupied, because she had already outsourced the parts of herself that used to belong to us, and she was doing it with such composure that I felt foolish for not seeing it sooner. One night, sitting alone in the living room while she was working late, I imagined her body pressed against someone else's, imagined the way she might look at him with the attention she no longer gave me, and instead of anger, I felt something colder and heavier settle into my chest, a realization that whatever this was, it wasn't temporary or accidental. She had built a second life with enough care that it didn't disrupt the first until she was ready, and I was just a fixture she planned to remove when it suited her. When she finally came home, smelling faintly of unfamiliar cologne, she spoke to me with the same gentle tone she used when explaining things to children, telling me how exhausted she was, how lucky she felt to have such a stable marriage, and I nodded along while understanding, with terrifying clarity, that stability was exactly what she was using me for. I didn't confront her, didn't demand confessions or tears, because I understood something important in that moment, something that would shape everything that followed, which was that she believed she was smarter than me, calmer than me, more in control of the story than I could ever be. As she went to bed, leaving me alone with my thoughts, I sat there and let the truth settle fully into place, not as a question or fear, but as a fact that changed the rules of my life. She was cheating, yes, but more than that, she was certain I would never see it coming, and that quiet confidence of hers, the belief that I was too loyal or too blind to notice, was the first thing that made me realize this wasn't just an ending, but the beginning of something I hadn't planned yet, but already knew I would finish. I found out who he was in the least cinematic way possible, which somehow made it more humiliating, because there was no confrontation or confession or spike of adrenaline, just a name mentioned casually in a story my wife told at dinner, delivered with the same tone she used when talking about coworkers or neighbors, and my body reacted before my mind caught up, because something in her voice tightened just enough to register. She said his name while describing a work meeting, said it like it was nothing, said it like she hadn't rehearsed it in advance, and I nodded along while a strange pressure built behind my eyes, because I had already heard that name before, weeks earlier, in a different context, from a different mouth, and my brain started doing the math without asking permission. Later that night, when she was asleep and breathing evenly beside me, I sat in the dark scrolling through social media with the kind of calm that only comes when you've already accepted the worst. And there he was, exactly as unremarkable as I feared he would be, a man close to my age with a stable job, a polite smile, and a life that looked disturbingly similar to mine, complete with weekend photos, friendly comments, and a wedding anniversary post from years ago that talked about partnership and loyalty, in the same hollow language my wife used when she thought she was being sincere. The realization that she hadn't chosen someone wildly different from me, but someone almost interchangeable, hit harder than any insult, because it meant I wasn't being replaced for my flaws but for my familiarity, that she wanted the comfort of the same shape without the inconvenience of history. Once I knew who he was, I couldn't stop seeing him everywhere, not physically at first, but as an idea that infected everything, because every time my wife mentioned work stress or office politics, I wondered whether he was part of that sentence, hiding just out of frame. I learned his routines without meaning to, the gym he went to, the coffee shop he favored, the neighborhood he lived in, and each detail made the situation feel smaller and more claustrophobic, because this wasn't some distant betrayal happening in another city or another world. This was a man whose life intersected with mine in invisible ways, a man whose wife probably stood in the same grocery store aisles I did, debating the same boring decisions, believing in the same lies. I started paying attention to her without meaning to, noticing her in tagged photos, her posture slightly tense, her smile always polite but rarely relaxed, the way she leaned toward him in pictures without quite touching, and I felt a jolt of recognition that made my stomach twist, because she looked like someone who was holding a marriage together with routine rather than love. The first time I saw her in person was outside a school event I had no business being at, and when our eyes met for a fraction of a second, there was no drama or spark, just a strange sense of familiarity, like looking into a distorted mirror. And I remember thinking, with a clarity that scared me, that if I ever spoke to her, she would understand things about me without explanation, because we were living parallel versions of the same lie. When my wife later talked about that same event, laughing about how exhausting it had been, I listened quietly and realized that while she believed she was managing two separate realities with precision, those worlds were already bleeding into each other, and somewhere in the middle of all that overlap was a woman who didn't know my name yet, but already felt closer to me than my own wife did, and that knowledge settled in my chest not as hope or anger, but as a steady, unsettling focus that refused to go away. I didn't plan to meet her, not really, because planning would have meant admitting I wanted something from the encounter, and at that point I was still pretending to myself that this was about understanding the damage rather than stepping into it. But life has a way of arranging collisions when too many secrets are occupying the same small space. It happened in a grocery store on a Tuesday evening, the kind of painfully ordinary place where betrayals shouldn't exist but somehow thrive. And I recognized her before she recognized me, standing a few feet away comparing prices with the distracted intensity of someone used to stretching effort across too many invisible demands. I knew it was her because I had memorized her face without realizing it, because I had already learned the way her shoulders held tension, and the way her eyes searched rooms like she was always bracing for disappointment. And when our carts bumped lightly at the end of the aisle, she looked up and apologized with a smile that froze halfway through as something unspoken passed between us. I told her it was no problem, that it was my fault, and she laughed softly in relief before saying something about how crowded everything felt lately. And I replied with a comment about time moving too fast. And there it was, the first crack, the recognition that neither of us was speaking about groceries at all. She asked if I lived nearby, and when I answered, her expression shifted again. not suspicious, but curious, like she was rearranging a puzzle she hadn't known she was working on. And when she mentioned her husband's job in passing, watching my reaction more closely than the words required, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me, because I realized I wasn't angry standing there. I was alert, present in a way I hadn't been in months. We talked longer than strangers usually do, drifting from aisle to aisle without acknowledging what was pulling us along. And when she joked about how exhausting marriage could be when one person carried all the emotional weight, I didn't deflect or minimize it the way I always did at home, but said carefully that sometimes exhaustion came from being the only one still trying, and she stopped walking entirely then, gripping her cart like she needed something solid to hold on to. She looked at me and said, in a voice that was steady but thin, that she felt like she was always performing normalcy for someone who had already left the building. And before I could stop myself, I told her that I understood exactly what that felt like, that there was a particular loneliness in sharing a bed with someone whose mind was elsewhere. And the silence between us thickened, not awkward but charged, like we had both stepped closer to a truth neither of us had permission to say. She asked my name, I gave it, and when she said hers it felt heavier than it should have, like the beginning of a sentence neither of us knew how to finish. And when we finally parted near the exit, she hesitated before saying, with a careful half-smile, that it had been nice talking to someone who didn't rush to explain her feelings away. I watched her leave, feeling something I hadn't expected at all, not jealousy or rage, but validation, a quiet confirmation that I wasn't imagining the distance in my own marriage, that the emptiness had a shape and a witness. And as I walked to my car, I realized that for the first time since everything started unraveling, I didn't feel alone with the truth, and that realization, more than any thought of revenge or justice, was the thing that made my pulse quicken and my resolve begin to form. By the time our conversations became a pattern instead of an accident, I had stopped pretending they were harmless, because there is a difference between coincidence and intention that you feel in your body long before you admit it to yourself. And every time I found myself timing errands to overlap with hers or lingering after events where I knew she might be present, that difference pressed heavier against my ribs. We never labeled what we were doing, never acknowledged the thin ice we were standing on, but we talked the way people do when they are starved of honesty, slowly at first, and then with an urgency that surprised both of us, trading fragments of our lives like evidence we hadn't known we were collecting. She told me about the nights she stayed awake listening to her husband breathe, wondering when she had become invisible to someone who still reached for her out of habit. And I told her about the way my wife spoke to me like a colleague she was managing rather than a partner she desired. And as we spoke, there was a strange relief in not being interrupted or corrected or reassured into silence. When she listened, she leaned in without touching me, her eyes steady and intent, and I realized how long it had been since anyone had looked at me without trying to steer the conversation toward comfort instead of truth. One afternoon, sitting across from each other in a quiet cafe, she said, with a humorless smile that didn't quite hide the ache underneath, that she felt like she was married to a ghost who still paid bills and attended functions, but had left everything else behind. And I answered her by saying that my marriage felt like a performance where the audience had already gone home, and the way her breath caught at that made the space between us feel charged with something that wasn't quite attraction yet, but was already more dangerous than friendship. As the weeks passed, the similarities between our lives stopped feeling coincidental and started feeling almost scripted, because the stories we told mirrored each other so precisely that it was impossible not to notice the pattern. The late nights explained away, the sudden bursts of affection that arrived without context, the vague dissatisfaction framed as personal growth. She described arguments that never quite happened because she had learned, like I had, that asking the wrong questions only trained your partner to lie better. And when I told her about the way my wife spoke about independence with a brightness that didn't include me, she nodded slowly and said that her husband had started using the same words, as if they were all reading from the same manual. There was comfort in that recognition, but also a growing tension that settled into every pause, because while we insisted we were just talking, just comparing notes, our bodies were less committed to the lie, leaning toward each other, voices lowering, hands lingering too long on coffee cups. One evening, as we walked together through a dimly lit parking lot, she laughed softly and said, "It's strange how easy this feels, isn't it? Talking to you like this." And I replied, choosing my words with care, that ease sometimes arrived when you stopped pretending to be someone you weren't, and the look she gave me then was heavy with meaning, full of things neither of us was ready to say but both of us felt intensely. I noticed the way her jacket slipped slightly off her shoulder as she turned, noticed the warmth of her presence when she stood too close, and instead of pulling away, I let myself register the attraction without acting on it, because acknowledging it felt honest in a way that denying it no longer did. What unsettled me most wasn't the growing desire or the intimacy of our conversations, but the way she remembered things about me that my wife never did, small details I mentioned once and forgot about myself, the way she asked follow-up questions that showed she had actually listened rather than waited for her turn to speak. When I told her about a project at work that had kept me up late for weeks, she asked how it had turned out days later, and the simple act of being remembered made my chest ache with a mix of gratitude and anger I couldn't separate. She never minimized my hurt or tried to explain it away, never suggested that I was overreacting or misinterpreting things, and when I admitted one night that I felt foolish for not seeing the affair sooner, she said, in a voice that was calm and unwavering, that trusting someone you loved was not a flaw, that it was the foundation they had chosen to exploit. The air between us thickened then, heavy with understanding and unspoken want, and for a moment I imagined what it would feel like to close the distance, to test whether this connection could become physical, but instead we sat there, suspended in restraint, because crossing that line would have meant something different than we were ready to define. As I drove home afterward, the silence in my house felt louder than ever, and I realized that without planning it, without naming it, I had found myself in a parallel life that felt more real than my own, and that realization didn't scare me as much as it should have, because for the first time in a long while, I felt seen rather than managed, desired rather than tolerated, and that shift, subtle and quiet, was already changing the way I thought about everything that was coming next. Somewhere in the middle of all that quiet understanding, something shifted without either of us acknowledging it, because relief can masquerade as innocence for only so long before it starts asking for more, and I could feel myself leaning into the space she created simply by being present. I told myself it wasn't revenge, that it wasn't even desire in the way people usually mean it, because I wasn't plotting or fantasizing about her body so much as I was breathing easier when she was near, my shoulders lowering in a way they never did at home. Still, my wife seemed to sense something changing, not because she suspected me, but because cheaters are hypersensitive to shifts in control, and she started becoming oddly attentive, touching my arm when she passed, asking questions she didn't wait to hear the answers to, initiating sex with a deliberate enthusiasm that felt timed rather than felt. Lying beside her afterward, staring at the ceiling while she slept with the confidence of someone who believed she was still managing the narrative, I realized how hollow it all felt, how her desire arrived only when it was convenient, only when she needed reassurance that she hadn't fully lost me yet. Meanwhile, the other man grew strangely absent in my wife's stories, his name no longer slipping out as casually, his presence implied rather than spoken, and I could sense a tension there that didn't match the certainty she had carried before, like a thread being pulled too hard from the wrong angle. With his wife, the conversations deepened in ways that felt inevitable, moving from shared frustration into moments of charged silence where neither of us pretended not to notice how close we were sitting, how our knees brushed, how her hand lingered on my wrist when she laughed. There was attraction there, undeniable and warm, threaded through with restraint that made it hum rather than explode, and one evening when she met my eyes and said, softly but clearly, that she hadn't felt wanted in years until someone actually listened to her, the words settled between us with a weight that made my pulse thrum. I didn't touch her then, didn't cross that line, but I let the tension exist without denying it, because denying it would have been another kind of lie, and I was done pretending lies were harmless. At home, my wife grew careless in the way people do when they believe they are ahead of everyone else, leaving her phone unattended for longer stretches, taking calls in the same room instead of disappearing, speaking with a confidence that suggested she thought the worst danger had passed. She talked about future plans that didn't quite include me, framed as hypotheticals or jokes, and I listened with a new kind of attention, hearing the gaps and assumptions she didn't bother to fill anymore. When she complained about how distracted her lover had become, dressing it up as workplace drama or personality flaws, I nodded sympathetically while understanding that whatever certainty she once had was eroding, and that erosion was not accidental. With his wife, I noticed a parallel shift, her posture straighter, her voice steadier, as if something inside her had clicked into place. And when she told me, one night over drinks, that she had started paying closer attention to finances and schedules and conversations she used to tune out, there was a glint in her eyes that told me this wasn't just emotional survival. It was preparation. The attraction between us intensified in that space of shared awareness, charged by secrecy, but grounded in restraint. And when she leaned closer and said she trusted me in a way she hadn't trusted anyone in a long time, I felt the weight of that trust settle heavily and deliberately into my chest. This was no longer just about finding comfort in familiar pain or proving anything to anyone else. And as I drove home that night, my wife already asleep when I arrived, I understood with startling clarity that whatever was unfolding had passed the point of being accidental. I wasn't drifting anymore, and neither was she, and while it still looked from the outside like a simple story of mirrored affairs and poetic symmetry, I could feel something more precise forming underneath it all, something quieter and far more consequential, because for the first time since my marriage began to rot from the inside, I wasn't reacting to betrayal. I was choosing where to stand next, and that choice felt steady, intentional, and irreversible. She told me the truth on a night that felt deliberately unremarkable, which in hindsight made sense, because revelations like that don't need ceremony when they're strong enough to stand on their own. We were sitting in her car after a long walk, the engine off, the windows cracked just enough to let in the sound of distant traffic, and there was a tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. Not nervous exactly, but resolved, like someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. I was talking about something mundane, a complaint about work that I didn't really care about, when she interrupted me gently and said my name in a way that made me stop immediately, because there was weight behind it that demanded attention. She looked straight ahead for a few seconds before turning to me, and when she spoke, her voice was steady in a way that made my stomach tighten, because steadiness like that doesn't come from impulse. She told me she needed to say something before things went any further, that she didn't want to keep building on half-truths, and I nodded without speaking, because I could already feel that whatever she was about to say was going to rearrange the story I thought I understood. She said she had known about the affair for a long time, longer than I had even suspected my own wife, and the words landed quietly but heavily, like something settling into place rather than exploding. I asked her what she meant, whether she had proof or had confronted him, and she shook her head slowly, explaining that it hadn't started with evidence but with a feeling she couldn't shake, the same kind of instinct that tells you when a room has changed after someone leaves it. She described noticing small shifts years ago, the way her husband started guarding his phone, the way his affection became sporadic and strangely performative, the way he talked about freedom and reinvention with a brightness that didn't include her, and she said that instead of confronting him, she decided to watch. She told me she wanted to know who he really was when he thought no one was paying attention, wanted to understand whether the distance was temporary or fundamental. And as she spoke, I realized that while I had been drowning in shock and confusion, she had been standing very still, observing, collecting impressions and patterns with a patience that bordered on frightening. When I asked her how she could live with that knowledge without saying anything, she looked at me then, really looked at me, and said that reacting too soon only taught liars how to hide better, and she refused to give him that advantage. She explained how she had paid closer attention to finances, to schedules, to the language he used when he thought he was being clever, how she noticed money moving in small, deliberate ways, how she quietly consulted professionals under the guise of unrelated errands, how she prepared herself emotionally for outcomes she didn't want, but refused to be blindsided by. There was no bitterness in her voice as she spoke, no dramatic flair, just a calm recounting of choices made deliberately and alone, and I felt a strange mix of awe and humility listening to her, because while I had been unraveling in private, she had been fortifying herself in silence. She told me that meeting me hadn't been part of any plan, that our conversations had been unexpected but clarifying, because hearing my experience from the other side confirmed what she already knew, not just about the affair, but about the kind of man her husband had become. When she admitted that she had waited to say any of this until she trusted me enough to hear it without trying to fix it, something in my chest loosened painfully, because trust offered like that is both a gift and a responsibility. I asked her, quietly, why she was telling me now, and she exhaled slowly before answering that pretending ignorance had served its purpose, that she no longer needed to play that role, and that whatever happened next, she wanted it to be built on truth rather than assumption. She said she wasn't asking me for anything, wasn't proposing an alliance or a plan, but she wanted me to understand that she was not naive or unaware, that she had been standing in the middle of this storm with her eyes open long before I arrived. As the words sank in, the dynamic between us shifted in a way I hadn't anticipated, because the idea that she had known all along reframed everything, our conversations, our attraction, even my own sense of control, and I realized that while I thought I was slowly reclaiming power by choosing where to invest my attention, she had never truly lost hers. When we finally got out of the car, standing there in the dim light, the air between us felt heavier and more charged than ever, not just with desire, but with mutual recognition. Two people no longer pretending to be victims of circumstance. Driving home afterward, the house waiting for me in its familiar silence, I understood that this was no longer a simple story of mirrored betrayals or accidental connections, because the woman I had grown close to was not discovering the truth alongside me. She had been carrying it with composure and foresight all along, and that knowledge settled into me with a mix of respect, attraction, and a sharpened awareness that whatever came next would not be driven by chaos or impulse, but by people who had finally stopped underestimating themselves. Once everything was said out loud, the space between us changed in a way that was subtle but irreversible, because honesty has weight, and when you set it down between two people who have both been lied to for too long, it stops being abstract and starts shaping behavior. We didn't announce an alliance or shake hands over some dramatic pact, but our conversations shifted from sharing pain to comparing realities with intent, laying timelines side by side, noticing overlaps and inconsistencies that felt obvious only in hindsight. She told me dates and moods and absences, and I filled in gaps from my own life without embellishment, and what emerged was not a story of passion or spontaneity, but one of calculation. Two people feeding each other narratives while assuming the rest of us were too distracted to notice. There was a strange calm in that process, not because it was easy, but because it stripped away confusion, and for the first time since my marriage began to fracture, I wasn't guessing anymore. I was confirming. We talked about finances in the abstract at first, about how money moved when someone was planning an exit, about the quiet ways people prepare to land elsewhere, and when she described actions she had already taken, steps she had put in place long before I arrived in the picture, I realized that what connected us now wasn't just mutual attraction or shared betrayal, but a clarity that made panic unnecessary. We weren't reacting. We were observing with purpose. At the same time, we maintained the illusion that nothing had changed, which was harder than it sounded, because awareness sharpens every interaction, and pretending ignorance requires discipline. My wife continued her routines with an ease that bordered on arrogance, convinced that whatever cracks had appeared were cosmetic, and I watched her with a new detachment, noting how she spoke about the future as if it were a room she had already stepped into without me. When she reached for me, touched my shoulder, initiated sex with that carefully timed enthusiasm, I participated without revealing anything, understanding now that withholding reaction was its own form of power. With her husband, the same pattern played out from the other side, his confidence eroding in small ways, his charm faltering when it didn't produce immediate reassurance, and his wife played her role with precision, offering just enough normalcy to keep him comfortable while quietly documenting everything that mattered. We never discussed revenge as a concept, never framed what we were doing as punishment, because that would have cheapened it, turning something deliberate into something emotional, and instead we focused on positioning, on ensuring that when the truth finally surfaced, it would do so on terms we didn't have to scramble to accept. The attraction between us didn't disappear in that process. If anything, it intensified, grounded now in mutual respect rather than fantasy, and there were moments when the tension felt almost unbearable, sitting across from each other knowing how easily we could cross a line that would simplify everything and complicate it at the same time. Once, when she leaned closer to show me something on her phone, her hair brushing my cheek, I felt the heat of her presence settle into me, a reminder that this connection wasn't purely strategic, that desire was woven through it whether we acknowledged it or not. She met my eyes then and held them, not flirtatious, not shy, but aware, and said quietly that whatever happened, she wanted it to happen cleanly, without lies layered on top of lies, and I understood that restraint was part of that cleanliness, that waiting was not denial, but intention. That understanding created a bond that felt stronger than impulse, because it was chosen repeatedly, rather than indulged once. As weeks passed, the sense of control returned in small, satisfying increments, not as dominance but as stability, a feeling that the ground beneath us was no longer shifting unpredictably. We shared updates without urgency, trusting that time was working with us rather than against us, and there was comfort in knowing that neither of us was carrying the full weight alone anymore. Driving home one night after seeing her, the familiar quiet of my house didn't feel quite as oppressive, because it was no longer a place where things were happening to me without my consent. It was simply a space I was moving through on my way to something else. I realized then that alignment didn't require declarations or dramatic gestures, just consistency and clarity. And as I watched my wife move through our shared life with the confidence of someone who believed she was still ahead of the game, I felt no urge to correct her, because the most effective shifts happen long before anyone realizes the balance has changed. I learned the truth about my wife's endgame the same way I had learned everything else, not through confession but through alignment, through details that snapped into focus once I stopped viewing her affair as reckless desire and started seeing it as logistics. It came together over a quiet evening with her lover's wife, sitting across from each other while rain streaked down the windows, when she mentioned something almost casually about exit strategies and how people rarely jump without checking where they might land. She wasn't talking about herself, not directly, but the phrasing stuck with me, and on the drive home I replayed months of conversations with my wife that I had previously dismissed as abstract dissatisfaction. All those comments about financial independence, about not wanting to start over with nothing, about how terrifying it was to be trapped by shared assets and expectations. Suddenly the affair looked less like a rebellion and more like scaffolding, emotional reassurance paired with contingency planning, and once I saw it that way, I couldn't unsee it. I started paying attention to timing, to when she asked questions about accounts, to how she framed discussions about future expenses, to the way she tested boundaries by floating ideas about separation disguised as jokes. It became painfully clear that she wasn't in love. She was preparing, using sex and attention as fuel while she mapped a cleaner exit. And the man she was sleeping with wasn't her destination so much as her leverage, a promise of support she could point to when fear crept in. The irony, which settled in slowly and then all at once, was that he was never capable of delivering what she believed he had offered, because he was far more interested in the fantasy of escape than the cost of actually following through. The confirmation came when I finally compared notes more directly, laying out timelines with his wife and realizing that while my wife thought she was playing a careful long game, she had misjudged almost every variable that mattered. He had been telling her what she needed to hear, mirroring her language about freedom and reinvention, promising a future he had no intention of financing or standing publicly behind. And she, in turn, had been telling him exactly what made him feel powerful, dangling the illusion of being chosen without ever demanding proof. They weren't partners. They were mutually exploiting each other's dissatisfaction, and neither of them realized how transparent it looked from the outside once you stopped believing the romance narrative. His wife told me, with a faint, humorless smile, that she had suspected as much for a long time, that men like her husband loved the idea of burning down their lives, but froze the moment the match actually touched something valuable. Hearing that reframed my anger into something sharper and more controlled, because it meant my wife's confidence was built on assumptions that were already failing, and she had no idea how exposed she truly was. She thought she was orchestrating an elegant transition, but in reality she was standing on promises that dissolved under scrutiny, and the ground beneath her was far less solid than she imagined. At home, I watched her with new eyes, noticing how she spoke about her lover with a frustration she tried to hide, how she complained about his inconsistency while still defending him reflexively, and I understood that the cracks were already there, spreading faster than she could patch them. She had mistaken secrecy for safety, passion for planning, and I felt a strange calm knowing that her careful preparations were fundamentally flawed, not because of anything I did, but because she had chosen the wrong accomplice. With that realization came a shift in me as well, because the need to expose or confront faded, replaced by patience, by the knowledge that timing would do more damage than anger ever could. Sitting alone one night, the house quiet around me, I acknowledged something that might have frightened me once, which was that the affair itself no longer felt like the core betrayal, but rather the assumption that she could outmaneuver consequences while underestimating everyone else involved. She believed she was engineering her freedom, but she was building it on sand, and as that truth settled fully into place, I felt no urge to warn her or intervene, because the most effective reversals don't announce themselves, they wait, letting confidence do the work of self-destruction. The unraveling didn't come with shouting or slammed doors, which I think disappointed my wife more than anything else, because she had prepared herself for a dramatic confrontation that never arrived. It began with small, controlled movements that she didn't notice until they were irreversible, accounts requiring dual signatures suddenly inaccessible, a meeting request from an attorney framed as routine planning, paperwork delivered with polite efficiency rather than accusation. When I finally told her we needed to talk, she sat across from me with that familiar calm, the one she had used for months to keep me compliant, and asked what was wrong as if the question itself were a courtesy. I didn't raise my voice or list grievances, didn't mention sex or betrayal, but explained, slowly and clearly, that I knew she had been preparing to leave, that I understood her assumptions, and that I had already adjusted my position accordingly. The color drained from her face not because she felt guilt, but because she realized she was no longer ahead of the timeline she thought she controlled, and when she asked how long I had known, her voice finally cracking despite her effort to contain it, I told her the truth, that the details mattered less than the pattern, and that patterns were impossible to hide once someone stopped trusting your explanations. She tried to pivot then, shifting from confidence to negotiation, speaking about fairness and partnership, about how people made mistakes and deserved understanding, and I listened without interrupting, because I wanted her to hear herself reach for narratives she no longer believed in. When I mentioned calmly that her lover had been far less committed to her future than she assumed, that promises made in secrecy had a way of evaporating under daylight, she stiffened, denial flashing across her expression before fear replaced it. She asked what I meant, demanded specifics, and I told her only that she should verify her assumptions before making irreversible moves, that relying on someone else's half-commitments was a dangerous way to plan a life. The silence that followed was heavy and revealing, and in it I could almost hear the mental recalculations she was making, the sudden realization that the safety net she thought she had woven was frayed beyond repair. Meanwhile, on the other side of this mess, her lover was experiencing his own quiet collapse, not through exposure or scandal, but through abandonment, as his wife finally withdrew the emotional labor that had kept him comfortable while he played at rebellion. When his wife told him she knew everything and had known for a long time, she didn't accuse or beg. She informed him of her decisions with a precision that left no room for argument, and he found himself alone with consequences he had assumed would always belong to someone else. What struck me most was how ordinary it all looked from the outside. Papers signed, schedules rearranged, conversations conducted in measured tones. Because revenge doesn't always need spectacle to be effective. Sometimes it just needs timing and restraint. My wife oscillated between anger and panic in the days that followed, lashing out at me for being cold one moment and trying to charm me the next. But the leverage had shifted too far for those tactics to matter. She had underestimated how much damage certainty could do to someone who relied on ambiguity, and as her options narrowed, her composure fractured in ways that felt almost intimate to witness. I didn't comfort her or gloat, didn't offer explanations beyond what was necessary, because the last word wasn't something I needed to speak out loud. It was embedded in the structure of what was happening. Watching her realize that her careful plans had collapsed under their own assumptions, that the man she trusted to help her escape was retreating into self-preservation, I felt a quiet, steady satisfaction settle into me. Not because she was hurting, but because I was no longer being managed or misled. The game she thought she was playing had ended without her permission, and for the first time since this all began, I understood that getting the last word wasn't about delivering a cutting line or dramatic revelation. It was about choosing silence when someone finally had nothing left to say. What remained afterward was not triumph in the way I had once imagined it, loud and vindicating, but a quiet reordering of my life that felt almost unsettling in its calm. The house emptied slowly, not all at once, her things disappearing in stages, as if she still believed there might be a way back if she didn't sever everything too quickly. And I let that illusion exist, because correcting it served no purpose anymore. The silence changed character once she was gone, losing its accusatory edge and becoming neutral, even restful, because it no longer held secrets I was expected to ignore. I spent evenings sitting alone without replaying conversations or scanning memories for hidden meanings, and that absence of vigilance felt like freedom in a form I hadn't known how to name before. She tried a few times to reopen dialogue under the guise of closure, asking whether I ever missed what we had, whether I regretted how things ended, and I answered honestly but without softness, telling her that I missed the version of my life that had been real, not the one she had been rehearsing behind my back. Those conversations ended quickly once she realized I wasn't going to renegotiate the past to make her feel better about the future she had failed to secure. The woman who had walked through all of this with me didn't step into my life dramatically either, didn't arrive as a replacement or a trophy, but as a presence that felt earned through patience and shared restraint. We didn't rush into anything, didn't pretend that understanding automatically translated into permanence, but there was an ease between us that didn't need constant reassurance, a physical closeness that carried heat and intention without desperation. When we finally crossed that line, it wasn't fueled by anger or revenge, but by recognition, by the relief of being desired without being managed, touched without being used as a placeholder for someone else's escape plan. Lying beside her afterward, listening to her breathe, I felt grounded rather than consumed, aware of my body and my choices in a way that had been absent for years, and that awareness mattered more than the sex itself. We talked openly about what we wanted and what we didn't, about boundaries shaped by experience rather than fear, and there was no performance in those conversations, no script to follow, just two people choosing transparency because they were tired of paying the cost of pretending. I heard about my ex occasionally through mutual acquaintances, stories filtered through concern or curiosity, and I listened without interest, because her narrative was no longer mine to carry or correct. She had moved on in the way people do when their plans collapse, hastily and defensively, reshaping herself around explanations that preserved her sense of agency, and I wished her nothing, not harm and not forgiveness, just distance. Her lover faded from relevance entirely, a footnote in a chapter that no longer needed revisiting, and knowing that he had been left alone with the consequences of his own cowardice was enough without witnessing it firsthand. What surprised me most was how little I thought about revenge once it was complete, because the satisfaction hadn't come from watching anyone suffer, but from realizing that my life was no longer being directed by someone else's secrets. The last word, I learned, didn't need to be spoken or even recognized as such by the person it was meant for, because it lived in the choices that followed, in the absence of explanation, in the refusal to continue a conversation that had already ended. Now, when I look back on that period, it feels less like a story about betrayal and more like one about clarity arriving late but decisively, about what happens when you stop negotiating with someone who has already left and start investing in yourself instead. I don't pretend it didn't hurt or that I handled every moment perfectly, because there were nights when the weight of it all pressed down harder than I expected. But those nights passed, and what stayed was a steadiness I hadn't known I was capable of. I didn't get even by taking something from her or humiliating anyone publicly. I got even by refusing to be an afterthought in my own life, by choosing silence over argument and direction over reaction. In the end, there was no dramatic final scene, no victorious declaration, just a life that felt honest again, and that quiet, unremarkable reality was the most satisfying ending I could have imagined.